Hey, how's it going? Welcome to episode 1 of the podcast. I don't even have a name for it yet, but I just want to record an episode of a podcast. So here it goes. Episode 1. I just wanted to share my thoughts about Final Fantasy 15, which has just been delayed, but it's very, 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 very nearly out. So I thought this was a good time to discuss 15, and also I just wanted to just talk about Final Fantasy. So that's what this video is about. So 15 is nearly upon us, and my feelings are somewhat mixed, and I might even say subdued. I'm certainly not on a hype train for the game, but it looks interesting to me. I've watched a good number of the gameplay videos, and I've watched bits of the latest Gamescom footage, and it definitely seems like a pretty interesting RPG. That's how I feel about it right now. Am I expecting to get an experience similar to classic Final Fantasy games? Am I expecting that? No, I'm not, and that's unfair, I think, because the series has changed a lot at this point. Key members of the team that made some of those great classic Final Fantasy games, they no longer work at Square. It's a different era of Final Fantasy, and depending on if this game is good or bad, it's really going to define what Final Fantasy becomes in the next few years. I think that Square needs 15 to be a success to justify Final Fantasy's existence, because they're not just a developer anymore, they're a publisher too. They have a stable of popular Western titles, you got Hitman, you got Deus Ex, and these games are well reviewed. The new Deus Ex just got a bunch of really great reviews, so Square are doing pretty good as a publisher. But I do think that the overall brand has been somewhat damaged by the general reception to their more recent output as a developer. Probably from the mid-2000s onward, it hasn't really been the same, and that's due to a number of reasons. Key members of the development team that worked on some of the classic games, like Hironobu Sakaguchi and Nobuo Uematsu, the composer. These guys haven't worked on a mainline Final Fantasy in years. So I think it's important to judge the newer titles in the series, on their own terms, to get the most out of them. The confusing thing about Final Fantasy 15, though, is it's not really like one game. Like, you need to consider the history of the development, and the fact that when this game was announced, it was not Final Fantasy 15, it was Final Fantasy Versus 13, announced in 2006, I think, as part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis sub-series of Final Fantasy, which was this very grandiose plan, which basically involved developing a bunch of different projects at the same time, and all of them are connected in some way, be it the universe or thematically. I'm still not really sure how these games are supposed to fit together, but the theme of crystals, or the crystal, seems to tie into it in some way. The first release as part of this sub-series was, of course, Final Fantasy XIII, and Square Enix have been operating under the umbrella of Fabula Nova Crystallis pretty much up until now. Versus 13 was originally conceived as a spin-off, a faster-paced, more action-oriented RPG that shared more in common with Square's other big franchise, Kingdom Hearts, than a traditional FF numbered entry. And this game had its own development cycle. One which was very mysterious, they didn't release much footage. And in typical Square fashion, these trailers were heavily CGI and minimal gameplay, but there was gameplay. The game had reached that point in development where there was gameplay. But Versus 13 was ultimately cancelled, and we can only speculate about how far they actually got with the development. But the game as it is today has received a healthy development time. But we're not talking about the same game for 10 years. We're talking about 3 or 4 years with a new director. Tetsuya Nomura, who was, he was heading up the Final Fantasy Versus 13 project. He was the director. He's since been taken off to focus solely on Kingdom Hearts 3, as far as I understand. So at this point, Square decides that they are going to turn the original idea they had for Versus 13 into the next big Final Fantasy. And at this point, development begins in earnest on what we now know as Final Fantasy 15. Whether or not they started from scratch or they had something there from when Nomura was in charge, who knows? Yeah, I mean, this new guy, Tabata, I think his name is? I mean, wow, this guy, I wouldn't want to be in his shoes right now because that's a lot of pressure. I don't know if I could handle it. Let's hope Tabata can handle it. Because the expectations that are being put upon Final Fantasy 15 they're crazy, you know? Not only due to the 10-year development time, right? You know, the perceived 10-year development time, but because this is a mainline Final Fantasy game. Now, that's so much to live up to. So, in a way, Final Fantasy 15 is doomed from the start, in the eyes of a lot of old-school FF fans. But I think that, you know, if the game fails, I think Square will probably wrap up the series because I think with 15, this is their big attempt to come back. It's their big comeback. Can the new Square match up to the old Square? That's what Final Fantasy 15 is about, to me anyway. It's about, can Tabata take this game, finish it, and release it in the most spectacular fashion that anyone can imagine, producing one of the greatest fusion RPGs of all time. You know, it'll start a whole new thing. They want to beat The Witcher. They want to show the world that Japan makes the best RPGs, you know, and regain some of that prestige that they may or may not have lost over the last few years. If the game flops, I see them either just retiring the series or probably more likely, like now that I think about it, they'd probably just stop giving a shit and they'd start putting out Final Fantasies every year and just trying to make as much money from the name as possible. And they've already been doing that to a certain degree with some of their mobile games, and I'm sure there's a bunch of sketchy stuff floating around with the name Final Fantasy. I mean, some people really hate MMOs, you know, and Final Fantasy XI and Final Fantasy XIV are both hardcore MMOs. I personally, it's not my taste. That's not to say that MMOs are bad. I just don't, it doesn't quite click with me, that style of gameplay. So it's very, very like discouraging when two mainline titles in the series are both hardcore MMOs with minimal story. It's very confusing, and it's one of those Square decisions where it's just classic Square, like, that's weird. You know, any other company would have called it Final Fantasy Online. So, you know, when you look at 15, it does appear that Square are all in. Square Enix, I should say. They are committed to making this a successful game for future prosperity. I think it's important for them. And, you know, you can tell with the push this game's getting. The marketing campaign it's honestly one of the most impressive I've ever seen, you know. So hands down, you gotta give them some credit for that. I mean, I usually don't give a shit about game marketing. I just ignore it for the most part. But this is just the sheer spectacle. You can't help but just, like, be in awe of it, really. They've released a companion prologue it's a full-blown CGI movie released in theaters. Kingsglaive, I think it's called. And this movie, the Western cast, we got Sean Bean from Game of Thrones. We got Lena Headey, Queen Cersei from Game of Thrones. You can tell that Square Enix are just, the wallet is open. They are ready to go. They obviously have a very deep belief in the quality of Final Fantasy 15, and they're willing to go all in. Spared no expense. So that is why so much is at stake, I think. And it makes it a very, very interesting game, especially as a consumer, as a gamer. Are we going to benefit from Square's commitment to this? You know, I mean, because obviously they are so committed to the brand legacy that is Final Fantasy, that's why this needs to be a good game. So I think everyone really wins in this case, especially people that maybe haven't enjoyed the last few games. It seems to me like Square Enix understand this, and they've made adjustments to their game plan accordingly. And I feel like as long as I go into this new one without any expectations whatsoever, I think I'll enjoy it. But another thing that interests me quite a bit, actually, is just how this new title will compare to some of the other Tetsuya Nomura directed material that Square Enix have released over the past decade. Kingdom Hearts and some of the expanded universe material he came up with for Final Fantasy VII, like Advent Children, Crisis Core, that kind of stuff. How much of his influence is left over from Final Fantasy Versus 13's original development? Tetsuya Nomura obviously his background is in illustration and character design. That's where he came up within the company. I think he was a character designer for Final Fantasy VI maybe, and onward, I'm not really sure. Maybe he designed some of the characters for 6 and then he moved up, but, he has designed some of the best and coolest characters in the series, like 7, 8, 10. The guy is very creative and he has a very interesting style. But after they started to give him more directorial responsibilities after the departure of Sakaguchi and some of the other veterans, I really am just not a fan of his style of directing. I feel like he has a very anime feel, and I really enjoy anime. I have since I was a kid, but it's very different. I think the feel is so different from what I consider Final Fantasy to be. That's why I can't really get on board with some of the newer ones, and I think it's this aspect of the subjectivity of the Final Fantasy series, how every single one is so different and means something different to everyone individually, that it's put the creators of the new ones in a pretty difficult position, because how do they understand Final Fantasy? Do these new fellas, do they understand Final Fantasy the same way that Sakaguchi did? No, I don't really think they do, and I don't think anyone really does. I think that Yoshinori Kitase, he has his own way of interpreting what Final Fantasy means, and so does Nomura. It's just that when I look back and I think about Final Fantasy VII, that game for me, it really feels like a Sakaguchi game, more so than Kitase, I think, to me. I can feel his influence on that game after playing many of his other games, enough that I can get a sense of his style, even on some of the games that he didn't direct, including 7. I think that just having Sakaguchi on the team gave Final Fantasy a certain level of direction. This man had been involved since the beginning, and I guess a lot of people looked to him when questions came up, like this one, for instance, like what is Final Fantasy? I think, it would have been very easy to go to Sakaguchi and then him to tell you, this is what you need to be going for. And it feels to me like Square have yet to fully recover from the departure of Sakaguchi. And I'm hoping, and I think they're hoping too, that 15 will be the start of a new age of good Final Fantasies. That's what they want. And that's what I want, and that's what we all want. Jesus. We all want a good Final Fantasy. It's been so long, So long. I personally quite enjoyed 12. But not really as a Final Fantasy game, per se, more as just a pretty entertaining Japanese RPG. Which it was, but it was bizarre as well, because it was modeled after MMOs, so pretty weird gameplay system, and it didn't click for everyone, but I found it was pretty addictive, to be honest. But I found it pretty lacking in the story department, especially when you compared it to even Final Fantasy X a few years earlier. We're looking at a very richly designed world, and 10 lacks a lot of the depth of even the ones before it, but 10 still had a very distinct look and character to it. 12 is a lot less memorable, I find. The character designs are more generic. Some of the character designs are cool. I think Fran looks really cool. I quite like the character of Balthier. I think if he was the main character, that game could have really benefited, because Vaughn, who's Vaughn? Characterization was lacking big time, and the story didn't really have any direction. It was just a dull, kind of political thing. And the thing about 12 is that 12 really shouldn't have been called Final Fantasy either. Again, Square trying to push projects that maybe don't fit the Final Fantasy name. This is obviously a Square Enix move, It's like Final Fantasy XII initially, it looked more of like a sequel to Final Fantasy Tactics. It was headed up by the guy in charge of the Evilist team. Vagrant Story, if anyone ever played Vagrant Story, really weird, amazing action RPG for the PS1. It's called Vagrant Story. not Final Fantasy. So you judge it as such, you know, on its own merits. And it's more of an experiment than anything. I mean, like, I don't love the game. It's got some weird issues, but I still have a lot of respect for it and a lot of fondness for it, you know? It's really cool. But it's doing its own thing, and Final Fantasy XII is kind of doing its own thing as well. For one, the entire universe of Final Fantasy XII is shared with Vagrant Story and Final Fantasy Tactics. It's called Ivalice, and the Ivalice team worked on the Ivalice games, including Final Fantasy Tactics Advance and stuff. And I played a bunch of these Ivalice games, and they're pretty cool. They have their own vibe. Final Fantasy XII it's the same vibe. It's the Ivalice vibe. And I just really think that the game would have benefited from being called something different, or at least separated from the mainline series in some way. And it feels like maybe that was the original intention, like during early stages of dev. Hard to say. I mean, I have no idea, but hard felt was the absence of Sakaguchi, and it's been like that pretty much ever since. I don't know how much I want to discuss Final Fantasy XIII. I think I could probably have a separate video for that. I've got a lot of feelings about Final Fantasy XIII. But again, there is definitely something missing. And I think long-term fans are pretty tired of waiting for Square to get their act together and release something that recaptures some of the magic of the classic games. It's possible. I mean, they've had success with something like Bravely Default. I haven't played it personally, but I've heard that this is a totally old-school JRPG, old school, published by Square Enix for the 3DS, right? And people love this game. They love it. And Square are actually surprised at how well it did. Now we're getting a sequel, so I'm hoping that Square Enix have learnt some lessons and that they're on the same page as a lot of the fans. I think, because if there's one thing the company's been guilty of historically, it's, or at least since the Enix merger, it's just out of touch with its true audience, which is, you know, gamers. Like, gamers that are looking for something, you know, meaningful. I mean, that's what, to me, Final Fantasy has always been about. It's always such a deep experience. And not just depth of gameplay, depth of narrative. And that is, for me, the crucial element that has been lacking since Final Fantasy X. That is something that I don't know if it's possible to recapture, but if there's any chance of them succeeding, it's with 15. I really believe that. Okay, so I think I'm going to cut it there. I really wanted to do this for a long time, and I've decided I'm just going to do it, you know? So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting into some discussion with people, fans of the series, maybe people that are really looking forward to the game. I want to hear their take on the hype, and just chill and, yeah, talk about video games. So, okay. Thanks a lot for watching, and I will see you next time.